This video represents the remainder of the workbook that we were not able to go over in live class. So let's start with the first slide that we were not able to review. This is a slide on the calculation of what we call the price to earnings ratio, or for short, PE ratio. And this is a ratio of the value that the stock market, in other words, buyers and sellers on the open stock market, place on the earnings of a company. Now, we're going to look at this next slide as an illustration. This next slide is just for your information only. It is not part of your workbook. So let's assume that we have a company called Stable Company, and its earnings per share are currently $5 per share. And remember, we've calculated earnings per share. We did that in our last class problem. So at $5 a share, Stable Company makes a good rate. And that amount neither grows much or declines much. It stays around $5 a share. Now, in contrast, we have another company called GoGo Corporation, and GoGo Corporation was started just a couple of years ago, and its earnings have increased dramatically over the years, or over the last couple of years, and now its earnings per share are $5 a share. Now, if you take a look at this, both Stable Company and GoGo Company have earnings per share of $5. So in theory, you would think that the market would value both of those stocks at about the same price. But the market will not, and probably the major reason in this case is because Stable Company has got stable earnings and it doesn't go up, doesn't go down much. GoGo Corporation's earnings are steadily increasing. Now, in this case, I've come up with the theoretical price of $20 per share. That's what the market is paying for Stable Company. On the other hand, GoGo Company, because of its growth, the market is willing to pay $60 a share. So what you're doing is the market is paying $60 a share for $5 of earnings per share for GoGo, while the market's only willing to pay $20 per share for $5 of earnings per share for Stable Corporation. And again, it's based upon the market's perception of the future of the stock. And GoGo, the market is obviously perceiving that the EPS will probably grow. So there's a premium over Stable Company. Now we measure that through what we call the price to earnings ratio. And we take the price per share and we divide it by the earnings per share. So let's do that for Stable Company. So if we take $20 a share and divide it by, or $20 per share and divide it by $5 EPS, what that means is we are paying 4 times the earnings per share for Stable Company. In the case of GoGo Company, we are paying 12 times the earnings per share. So you can see that the market is valuing GoGo at 3 times the amount that they're valuing Stable Company at. So that's the process that we're going to use for our price to earnings calculation. So if we take a look at the PE formula again, it's basically our stock market price divided by earnings per share. Now we have a company called McMatter Corporation that reported earnings per share of $2.50 for the year, so that's our earnings per share. The corporation's common stock was trading for $30 a share, so that's what it's worth on the stock market. It asks you to compute the price to earnings ratio for the common stock. So we're going to apply this formula to the information in the word problem. Okay, our stock market price is $30 a share. The earnings per share are $2.50, and we do the division of 30 divided by $2.50, and here it shows that that the stock market is paying 12 times their earnings. Now, in this case, if we wanted to look at trends, let's assume that the PE ratio was 12 times during this year, then a year from now it's 12.5, then a year after that it's 13. That means the trend is increasing. And in that case, what that means is the market's willing to pay more for the equivalent earnings. So that's a favorable trend for the company. So in this case, it would be favorable. Okay, now let's look at the next calculation, and it's called the dividend yield calculation. And the dividend yield calculation is a percentage of dividends earned on a share of stock based upon the amount paid for that share of stock. So here we have Computer City, and the stock currently has a price of $96, and let's assume that an investor just bought that stock. Computer City declared cash dividends to be paid to all shareholders at the rate of $4.80 a share. So what we want to do is calculate the dividend yield formula, and the dividend yield formula is the dividend that is being paid divided by the price we paid for the share of the common stock. So again, looking at the word problem, the dividend paid was $4.80 divided by the $96 market price of the stock, and that means we're earning 5% based upon the dividend, based upon what we paid. And that's the dividend yield stock. Okay, now let's look at what we call the financial statement ratios exercise. And here at the top you're given a number of different financial statement ratios, and down the slide here it says, from the following ratios select the appropriate ratio to best answer each question below. So the first one is, I want to measure how efficiently accounts receivable are being collected. So if you remember from our cash cycle, we go from cash to inventory. There we measure inventory turnover, and that inventory then is converted to a receivable, and there we measure inventory turnover. So that would be the accounts receivable turnover ratio. Okay, now the second item is, I hold 5 shares of Google common stock. I want to know how much of Google's net income will be applicable to my share of common stock. And again, what I'm looking for is something that measures net income divided by my share of common stock. And in this case, the correct ratio would be earnings per share. There's the earnings per share. I want to know what would be the best measure of a company's ability to sell off its most liquid assets to pay off its current liabilities. In other words, I want to be able to liquidate my current assets, those assets, as quickly as possible. That would be the quick assets ratio, or again, it could be the asset test ratio. It means the same thing, but that would be the quick ratio. Okay, I am a creditor who's considered loaning money to ABC Company for 15 years, in other words, in the long term. What ratio trend, being a creditor, would I most likely consider to measure ABC's long-term credit risk? Remember we said that we talked about the debt ratio, and that's the answer, debt ratio. And what that means is, as my debt ratio goes up as a percentage of assets, there's a chance if I have a business downturn I won't be able to pay my debts. So the debt ratio is a good measure of long-term liquidity. Okay, the next one is, I'm an investor who's interested primarily in receiving dividends for a stock. What metric am I most likely to consider? So I'm an investor and I don't really care about the growth of the stock. Oh yeah, I'd like the price to go up, but I'm investing for the dividends. So I want to basically invest in the stock that'll give me the most bang for my buck with dividends. And I would measure that utilizing the dividend yield ratio. So that would be dividend yield ratio. Okay, the next one. I have been asked to identify common stocks where the stock market places significant values on the company's earnings. What metric must I use? And that's basically the metric from our 2 slides ago, and that would be our price to earnings ratio up here. There's price to earnings ratio. I want to know if a company has sufficient liquidity to operate over the current year under normal current operating conditions. Now, actually, you could have 2 different measures here. Here's the one I wrote down. It would be the current ratio right here. But also, you could use working capital, because working capital is the current assets over the current liabilities. The current ratio is simply the ratio of the current assets over current liabilities. So either of these measures or metrics would work. And the last metric, or the last item here, is kind of a duplicate of one of our other calculations. But what metric would I use to measure how quickly a company is collecting in its accounts receivable? And again, that would be the accounts receivable turnover ratio. Okay, you have an exercise here that talks about financial statement ratio trends. And what you need to do is indicate if the following ratio trends are favorable, unfavorable, you cannot determine. So evaluate each of the ratios based upon its own trend only. So let's start out with trend number one. We have a decrease in the price to earnings ratio. So what that means, if you remember the meaning of the ratio, is that that is the amount that shareholders or the stock market is willing to pay for the value of a company's earnings. So in theory, if the price to earnings ratio is increasing, that would indicate that's a favorable trend. In this case, since it is decreasing, that would be an unfavorable trend. Okay, now let's take a look at the debt ratio. The debt ratio is a percentage of assets that have been acquired in the company but have been acquired through third-party debt, meaning that as the debt ratio increases, in effect, the risk of liquidity to the company actually decreases. Assuming that a company takes on a lot of debt, they do have to pay that debt back over time. And if the company suffers a economic setback and decrease in their earnings, their decrease in their revenue, what's going to happen is they're going to be less likely to pay off any type of increased debt. So in this case, the ratio would be an increase in the debt ratio would be unfavorable. Okay, now we have an increase in quick assets ratio. If you remember, quick assets are those current assets that can be converted into cash very quickly to pay off current debts such as in an emergency. Now, the quick ratio means that the ratio of those quick assets to the current liability is actually increasing. So what that means is that as the ratio increases, we have more quick assets to pay down the current liabilities. So that would be considered favorable. Okay, decrease in accounts receivable turnover ratio. And the accounts receivable turnover ratio is a measure of how quickly you collect the entire balance of your accounts receivable. So if I have an accounts receivable turnover ratio of 5 times, that means I collect my accounts receivable 5 times during the accounting period. So therefore, if I have if my ratio is 5 times and it goes up to 6 times, that's an increase. And that would mean the increase in my accounts receivable turnover ratio means that I would be collecting my accounts receivable more efficiently. So in this case, this is a decrease in the accounts receivable turnover ratio, so it would be unfavorable. The next to last one is a decrease in working capital. And what that can be defined as the value of your current assets minus your current liabilities. So if you used all of your current assets to pay off your current liabilities, what's left over in the current assets would be considered your working capital. So your working capital, as it grows, means that you have the current assets over current liabilities is also growing. So an increase in working capital would be favorable, and the opposite is a decrease in working capital would be unfavorable. And the last item is an increase in return on equity. That represents the net income of the company divided by the average equity within the company. So if your net income increases relative to your return on equity, that would mean you would have an increase in return on equity. And under those circumstances, you'd be increasing your net income over your average equity. So that would be a favorable trend. And that's the end of the presentation for the last problem in our workbook. Thank you very much.